Kushner, Director of the Wayne Moore Center's Program for Democratic Governance, and I'm delighted you can join us for today's Public Affairs Speaker Series event featuring Professor Vesla Weaver. Her presentation today is titled The State from Below, Democracy and Citizenship in Policed Communities. This talk is also part of the 20th anniversary celebration of the Wayne Moore Center for Law and Politics. In the tradition of Oregon Senator Wayne Morse, our center embraces political independence and education as the building blocks of justice and democracy. We encourage civic engagement and dialogue by bringing students, scholars, activists, policymakers, and community members together to discuss issues affecting Oregon, our nation, and the world. As always, we're especially grateful to the members of the Wayne Moore Circle. Circle members provide critical support for our programs through annual donations, small, medium, and large. Please consider becoming a Wayne Moore Circle member with a donation of any amount. You can go to our website, waynemoorecenter.uoregon.edu, which I think will appear in the chat box for you if you would consider being a fundraiser. And you can also check out upcoming events as well at that site. So we are thrilled to host this vital talk and discussion featuring Dr. Vesla Weaver. Weaver is the Bloomberg Distinguished Associate Professor of Political Science and Sociology at Johns Hopkins University. Professor Weaver's research and scholarly publications illuminate the causes and consequences of racial inequality in the United States. They explore how state policies and institutions shape political life and identity, and they capture the efforts of increasing punishment and surveillance on democratic inclusion in America. Her books include Creating a New Racial Order, published with Princeton University Press, and Arresting Citizenship, The Democratic Consequences of American Crime Control, with University of Chicago Press. And my students are currently reading Arresting Citizenship this term and loving it. Professor Weaver was named an Andrew Carnegie Fellow in 2017. Today is Dr. Weaver's second visit with the Wayne Moore Center. She gave a talk in Eugene a few years ago. Professor Weaver today will talk for about 30 minutes, and then there will be an opportunity for a question and answer session with the audience. Please submit your questions via the chat feature. Questions will not be visible to the audience, but center staff will be collecting them and will attempt to get in as many as possible. So, Vesla, welcome. Oh, and you're on mute right now.
It wouldn't be a Zoom presentation without something like that. Thank you so much for having me, Dan. And
we're so glad you're here. And by the way, I should let everyone know that Vesla is beaming in on East Coast time. So in addition to going beyond the call of duty in terms of coming to us via Zoom, but she is doing this 3 hours later than we are. So with that, let me hand the baton to Vesla. Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for that generous introduction and for having the vision for this event and for engaging my work in Arresting Citizenship. Today, I'll be talking about a new book project that I'm writing that actually builds on themes from Arresting Citizenship. And I welcome your questions and your feedback, whatever kind of engagement. And I'm open to any questions about the civic infrastructure that we're building, as well as the findings. So let's get going. I'm going to actually share my screen. So if you'll give me just a second. Here we go. So you should see that in front of you. Today, our nation faces reconciliation. Government's ability to protect its citizens has broken down in the cradle of democracy. Years of footage of state violence, police choking out citizens as they struggled for air, shooting unarmed residents in the back or bed as they dreamed, dragging kids from suburban pools and slamming them, ending the lives of motorists as their 4-year-old children looked on. Such dramatic and repeated examples of violence were accompanied by vocal expressions of white supremacy in Charlottesville and other localities, police in combat gear raining down on protesters, and experiences of structural violence posed by a pandemic that exacted even more loss, in arguably the clearest depiction in decades of structural, systemic, and state violence in real time. They also displayed the power of the radical imagination in Black struggles for freedom to confront these violences by building new discourses of well-being and safety and justice and community responses to safety deprivation, the frameworks of the marginalized that inspired solidaristic responses in every city and suburb and rural hamlet in America. And finally, the fraying of the social compact has guided an urgent focus on how to improve democracy. Our moment demands new ideas for how we might reroute our approach so that the afterlives of police occupation do not retread the afterlives of Jim Crow and slavery. Yet the state violence and structural violence described here were paired with epistemic violence, a discounting of their knowledge by mainstream academics and policymakers who wrote, theorized, and designed policy from the perspective of those for whom domination, is not a core concern, and who continue to isolate questions of policing from questions of democracy. Our aim in the Portals Project, and I'll describe the portals to you in a bit, was to make people and communities who have not been able to lay claim to the core tenets of liberal democracy, freedom, autonomy, dignity and worth, constitutional protections, the center of a global conversation about the reach and limits of our democratic governance. And it seeks to do so by turning to the primary evidence base located in race-class subjugated communities, those who have historically always done the work of exposing American democracy's contradictions and have always posed some of the most incisive prescriptions for repair and reconciliation. And we did this by building an infrastructure that counters the architecture of inequality and isolation. So what are portals? They are immersive, publicly accessible, interconnected virtual environments that give people the sense of sharing the same room. And over the course of the next year and a half, from 2016 to early 2018, 2,000 people across 14 American neighborhoods in 6 cities exchanged experiences, homespun lyrics, or witnessed to one another and shared visions of freedom inside these virtual chambers. Mothers talked to mothers in other cities about losing kids to grievous acts of state violence. Activists exchanged ideas and strategies for contesting the construction of police stations while public schools were shuttered in their neighborhoods, and for creating systems of care and mutual aid. A resident of the north side of Milwaukee and residents in South Side Chicago in the midst of uprisings surrounding police killings of Sylvelle Smith and Laquan McDonald talked to East Baltimoreans who had already emerged from their own uprisings related to Freddie Gray. How do people describe and experience government? How do they understand their democracy and the actions of the state? How do they reconcile their experience of the unequal distribution of protection and repression with democratic ideals? How is the power of local police authorities interpreted, resisted, or deployed? And most basically, how do they imagine liberation? These are some of the most pressing questions of our time, questions that stretch back through our nation's history. Yet social scientists have few theories for describing how Americans experience and respond to state authority. And rarely do their conceptions inform our theories of democracy. So my colleague Tracy Mears, who's a legal scholar of policing at Yale, and Gwen Prouse, who's a doctoral student of African American Studies and Political Science at Yale, paired up with artist and tech entrepreneur Amar Bakshi, who had first designed this gold shipping container that is a portal in his backyard. And we located these portals in 14 neighborhoods across several cities in the US and one in Mexico City. We sensed the power of creating a community-defined, cross-community, collaborative civic space during a time when scholars bemoaned the decline of public things, to use Bonnie Honig's term, and the erosion of civic life and the social media-inspired cultivation of separate worlds. With the help of curators, we amassed the most extensive collection of firsthand accounts of the police by those who are policed to date, people who would not otherwise encounter one another. And here you're looking at the inside and the outside of a portal. So today, I'm first going to introduce to you the portal's method and civic infrastructure. And then I will explore 4 core arguments. I might not get to all of them given the time that we have. I want to leave enough time for conversation that emerge from this digital archive. Before I move on, it bears noting that for the past many years, as Dan mentioned, I've been at work at understanding what the largest transformation in the post-civil rights era means for the citizens that are impacted. You're looking at the rise in admissions, excuse me, by race over time. This, my early work tended to look at the sort of civic and political penalties that flowed from encounters with criminal justice. And one of the things that I argued in Arresting Citizenship was that these encounters were politically socializing, right? They had a chilling effect on the likelihood of citizens reaching out to government, voting, and engaging in the political process. And these kinds of questions still animate my research, and even more so in the aftermath of the uprising in my own city, Baltimore. And here you're looking at one of the billboards that went up, you know, whoever died from a rough ride, the whole damn system, it says, giving, you know, a visual imagining of the, you know, how the police basically severed the spinal cord of one of their residents. Here today, the question is really, how do we understand how people in highly policed communities understand their government, understand democracy, and how then, as scholars, should we begin to theorize and understand that democracy? And I've just written a piece in Science on racial authoritarianism in US democracy, and that's going to be a big part of the book. And this is just to show you some of my past work that's looking at the empirical effects of having a criminal justice encounter. I'm gonna break here and actually show you a video because it's better for you to understand what the portal's experience looks and feels like, and all of the ways the portals operated in the communities where they were housed.
There's a lot of police brutality out here. There's a lot of racial profiling. And it's the topic of discussion everywhere I go.
We promised ourselves as young Black folks in person, everything we see, feel, breathe here, I'm taking it home.
So we'll start a global community with the world, putting people differences aside. This is how we'll kill stereotypes. This is also our way of giving people the truth about culture.
Harris Pickett, Tamir Rice, Antoine Schubert, Alton Sterling, Philando Castile. Barely, barely. The Spirit says to me, don't look back.
So you can see a little bit of how the portals functioned in the communities that they were housed in. Part of what we were aiming to do civically was to create a communal gathering spot, a hub of civic life for people to share their narratives. And part of our research was only happening some of the time. The other moments were they were holding chess tournaments and sharing music with one another. They were doing global conversations. They were building music together. They were, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, the portal came to really mean something in the communities it was housed. In one community, they did a gang truce in the portal. And so it becomes this civic space, this place where the community's life and activity and driven by the goals of the community. And part of why we did this is we felt like the methods that we had for understanding highly policed communities and their theorizations of democracy and power were pretty much obsolete. We had learned very little from social surveys over the course of several decades from orthodox methods, in part because those surveys often asked the wrong questions, in part because survey research rarely went into these spaces and rarely sampled in halfway houses and prisons and detention centers and confinement spaces, pre-release centers. And in part because asking somebody whether they somewhat trust, always trust, or never trust the police really does little to shed light on the keen political vocabularies emerging in those spaces. So we wanted to do a couple things. We wanted to design a new method of data collection that can embed the virtues of political equality and recognition and a commitment to listening. And we were trying to build the practices and virtues of a better and alternative political world into the practice of social research itself, using the research space as a space to create politically connected communities and to create meaningful political dialogue. And this is an understatement, but this hasn't been a central mode of studying political life in our field. And civically, we wanted to see if we could harness this technology to see if we could create a public square of the unfree, allowing people and local groups to link to other cities and neighborhoods. And by introducing a public and social infrastructure, we not only study democratic deliberation and study democratic politics, we facilitate it as well. But not just that, we argue in the larger project that listening to the narratives of people in highly policed places offers a vital accounting of the American state and the democratic condition in our time. We argued that subjugated knowledge, to use Michel Foucault's term, is crucial for theorizing democracy, even if, especially if, it contradicts dominant wisdom and conceptualizes distinct action. We thought that understanding and theorizing government and state power requires examining its actual operation in real communities. And by looking not just at what democracy and the state's practices are meant to do and what institutions are meant to do in their formal representative structures, but what they actually do in communities and through some of the institutions that command the most authority in people's lives, we can arrive at uncommon insights into the actual practice of democracy and citizenship. Now, before I move on, I want to emphasize that while mainstream scholarship begins from, and you've probably heard some of this in your political science classes, T.H. Marshall's conception of citizenship and Robert Dahl's pluralism and political equality perspective, and seemed to discover threats to democracy that were the state of play in race-class subjugated communities, Black intellectual traditions have been contesting and reframing this view of America for at least half a century, calling into question democracy's coexistence with authoritarian modes of governance. Experience with police has been intrinsic to understandings of state power in the Black counterpublic, appearing in their sermons, memoirs, essays, oral histories, and poetry. Indeed, much of Black political thought and its trenchant critiques of American democracy has developed out of the experience of police oppression, terror, and safety deprivation. So while I will present themes today around state action from the bottom, or what I call the state from below, these potent storylines borrow from the past. From the first prison memoir written by a Black man in 1858, Austin Reed, born free but taken to the House of Refuge at age 6, to the narratives of ex-slaves collected in the Federal Writers Project during the Great Depression, to the oral histories of Black Americans who lived through Jim Crow in the 1930s and 1940s, to the Crown Heights and Detroit and Baltimore uprisings in 1967 and 68 and the oral histories collected in their aftermath, to John Gwaltney's collection in Dry Longso, to the writings of Blacks in the American Prison Writing Archive in the 21st century. And of course, Black-led campaigns to democratize police forces and police action in their communities have always shaped resistance movements. And in the broader book project, we will be drawing Portal's narratives with archival sources in the Black counterpublic since about the 1930s, and I'd be happy to speak more to those links. Now, I've explained a little bit, and hopefully you've seen that, seen the video and understand a little bit what Portals looks and feels like. Unlike the video you saw, what we did is we invited people in to share about a 20-minute conversation. Oh, and this, I'm just showing you pictures of historical campaigns to challenge police activity. This is one of my favorites to draw on because activists in Watts and in Seattle, in parts of the South, in Oakland, often had their own, what they were called either self-defense patrols or community alert patrols, where they would literally make their cars look like police cars. You can see one here, and it says "to protect and observe." And they would drive behind police, observing their actions. And particularly when police would arrest somebody, they would drive up behind, sometimes post the person's bail, take down notes about what happened, and help to check police incursions into their communities and track and investigate what the police were doing in their neighborhoods and to organize resistance to it. So the Portals stood in 14 communities in Baltimore, Newark, Milwaukee, Chicago, Los Angeles, and Mexico City. They are part of a global network. So the Portals are in 45 sites in every continent except for Antarctica. But for our research, we had them in these 14 neighborhoods in 6 cities. And we invited people to come in, have a 20-minute conversation, unscripted, unmediated by a researcher. We just simply asked them to talk about their experiences with police and what they feel about police. And then the research process was not always clean. Sometimes you would have one person come in on this side. There wouldn't be anybody on this side to talk to, so the curator would talk to the person. And then the curator would leave and somebody else would come in. We also collected some background information so we can understand what kinds of discursive themes come up in conversation when you're listening to an intergenerational conversation or a conversation between two people with very different experiences with police, or what happens when you're listening to two mothers talk to one another, or two activists talk to one another, or people, we had the portal before, during, and after the uprising in Milwaukee, and so we can understand how people are living through this important political time and political marker. Each of the dialogues was video recorded, transcribed, and coded. A key player, this is our portal in Mexico City. Here you're looking at curators talking to one another. Oftentimes afterwards, participants would jot something down about their experience in a gold book that sat outside each of the portals. I can talk more about this in the Q&A, but there are several virtues to the technology. They provide an intentional space for everyday unscripted political dialogue and interaction that is participant directed, that allows them to define what topics and language is meaningful in a community-driven setting characterized by equality, reciprocity, and unity of purpose, and run and informed, and this is important, by the goals and needs of communities themselves. The stakes of the exchange are lowered and don't hinge on past interactions or future expectations, but a shared position provides a foundation for deep and yet casual engagement. Today I want to explore, I'm not going to talk too much about the sample here, but you should know that over a third of participants, these are places of high levels of police contact. Over a third of participants reported that they had over 7 encounters with police, involuntary encounters with police across their life course. For men, that was more. I'll talk a little bit about some of the ways that the conversations began talking about policing interactions in childhood. And the point here is that we have several sources of variation that we're looking at. We're able to see cities with very different police histories. We're able to see different contexts even within those cities, right? Different neighborhoods. We're able to see different people within those contexts. So sometimes we're talking to Latino communities. Sometimes we've got people who have extensive experience in prison. Sometimes we're talking to people who are in the midst of activism. Sometimes we're talking to former gang members who are talking intergenerationally to younger people and explaining to them what it was like. And of course, we have different dyads within the box. I'm going to skip through this, but this just gives you a sense of how high the levels of police contact are. In Milwaukee, for example, in the Imani neighborhood, this is the highest incarcerated neighborhood in the entire United States. Most of our sample there reported being stopped in the last week or month alone. Right, high levels of contact. This bimodal distribution is really about gender. So even in the same cities, you get women saying that they've never had contact, and men saying they've had over 7 encounters. And I want to talk about 5 really anchoring themes that existed throughout the conversations. They, across complexity, across difference. Of course, people had very different experiences, very different personal histories, very different outlooks on policing. But these were really key frameworks and interpretive frames that people were bringing to the conversation. And the first is that I want to talk about was childhood. So one of the things we noticed immediately in the survey sample was people, the average age of onset of the first encounter with police among those who had been stopped, the average age was 14, right? I've been studying this arena for a long time, and this shocked me. The average age for Black participants in the study was even younger. It was 12. Here you can see, you know, the vast majority of the sample has more than 7 encounters, and the age of those encounters is hitting, you know, before they're even beyond adolescence, right? At the tender age of 14 and sometimes below. And this also comes up in the course of conversations. People talked about childhood and the first moment, the baptism, if you will, of having a police encounter as being highly consequential for their life. And let me just show you a few examples. So this person says, I've been having problems with them since I was 12. I will remember this day because it was my first encounter. They ran past us and the police just came up and just grabbed up me and my cousin. We not with them. We don't even know them. And I remember this officer. He was officer, and she names him. Yep, that was his name. He a real big dude. Like, I was scared as shit. I was 12 years old. I thought I was gonna die. The first time police stopped me, I was 11 years old, and they stopped me because I was playing water balloon fights with my friends during the summer. And they handcuffed all of us. They paraded us in front of the community. They had the helicopter on us. And this was like a group of 11-year-olds. Like, nobody was older than 13. And like, they had guns on us. Like, they pointed a gun to my head and they threatened our lives. This one actually goes on to say something like, and after that point, the community really didn't trust me, didn't thought we were up to doing something bad. Yeah, here it is. Because afterwards, even though we were kids, like, the entire communities thought that we were up to something bad. So like, it really changed the perspective of how like my neighbors looked at me and how they reacted towards me. But it was like, you know, it wasn't a one-time thing. It was like the beginning of, basically, since then I've been getting stopped by police a couple times every year. I thought it would stop as I'd gotten older, but it hasn't. Every time they stop me, I feel like my life is on the line, and I feel like that could honestly be the last time I'll be breathing, because they feel threatened by me. I'm a big guy. I'm like 6'2", and I weigh about 260 pounds. So every time they like come around me, they get really, really nervous, and they always have their guns out. And it's just like a split-second decision could end my life, basically, you know. At a young age, like 12 years old, I experienced the police. They come into my house, they're looking for one person, but they feel the need to put the gun to the head of a 12-year-old. And that's my first time seeing a gun. And it's like, wow, this is what I'm exposed to, like, just predetermined by who knows what, but not me being a young person. Because I just hit 19, I just finished high school, and I'm trying my best to be a positive influence on my community and really do something big. When I was about 14 and 13, I always been a full-figured girl. The police would stop me when I was walking outside with my friends at night. Are you a prostitute? Ask me questions like that. I'm a 13-year-old girl at the time. 8 years old was my first time getting pulled over for, you nigga for, you know what I'm saying, like walking with a group of other little niggas. We was out in the hood, like playing around with sticks, and we was all wearing the same colors and shit, you know what I'm saying, just to match each other because we was all friends type shit. But what they put that on? We gang banging. They just called us vice lords. We wasn't doing that shit. When I first got locked up, man, and put in a jail cell, I was 8 years old. I was in 2nd grade. And after that, bro, I was like 10, 11, 12, 13. Each one of those years, the police called me. They used to pick me up and drop me off on the other side of the motherfucking tracks. Oh, I'm sorry. I should say I am true to what people say in their narratives. And so you'll hear a lot of cursing. I think the thing that I've been developing is this idea that policing, we tend to think of it as something that happens to people when they're 25 years old. But policing is a childhood intervention. And as a childhood intervention, it is highly destructive and derailing to young people's outcomes. right? People mention not being able to get jobs, being able, the first time they get their license, then they get it taken by police. They talk about the humiliation of learning the rights and routines of kissing the pavement and of expecting early police encounters. The second theme I wanted to point to is one that I'm calling misrecognition. And this idea, actually, before we read this, let me just describe the idea. And I should emphasize that not every conversation had these themes, but a lot of these umbrella kind of themes are ones that were currents sort of flowing through and across lots of difference. They were ones that had broad resonance. They were the basis of ideas, even if the ideas themselves were complex. Sometimes you'll get a conversation where there's disagreement. Sometimes how the conversation begins in the early part, it ends up at a very different place. Misrecognition is the idea that that people felt their communities and their selves and their families were not understood by state authorities. The idea goes beyond the simple one that my preferences aren't known or valued or my identity isn't culturally included. That's the way recognition is sometimes used within, political theory, Charles Taylor's work, or work by the sociologist Michel Lamont. It's the idea that people feel reduced to simplistic schemas and categories in interactions with the state, and important aspects of the self are negated by how the state approaches and interacts with one. Oftentimes, participants make the observation that the character of the state's knowledge about them or their community is misaligned with core aspects of who they are or how their community actually is. Aspects of my identity are discounted or flattened or governed by a predefined script. My inwardly generated idea of myself conflicts with how the state externally imposes its image of me. And most importantly, I have very little power to define myself in interactions with police or the government. I don't have different tastes, desires, opinions from the categorical group that the state has placed me in. Many parents spoke of how their kids had no wiggle room to find out what kind of person they are, and so kid-related acts become suspicious. Many participants spoke of how police are incapable of seeing them as victims, taxpayers, parents, humans, someone worthy of respect. Let me show you a few of these. So this is a conversation between two men, and one person says, "But you got to think about it, man. These police officers come in from suburb areas where they rarely see Black people. And then they not only seeing Black people, they seeing the stereotyped Black person, in the hood, street niggas, they seeing the gutter. First of all, they terrified really. They can put that badge on, put that suit on. They got to have a face to where they got to make it seem like they're not. But in reality, I know that they is terrified. I'm terrified sometimes walking through these damn neighborhoods. So these damn police officers come in from all type of other places and pulling up, telling us what to do, how to do, and where." And then he goes on to actually make a key distinction. "A lot of people get the wrong idea about police. Like you said, there's good police officers out here as well as teachers. I don't feel like a person who don't come from this area, who don't come from especially the ghetto, I don't think they should be policing and teaching because they don't understand us. There's things about us they don't understand. Then they could never understand because they haven't been through what we've been through. They haven't seen what we've seen. Most Black people, they uncles and cousins and best friends is drug dealers. The killer, that my uncle is a drug dealer. It's like, damn near ain't no way I can't see this shit." They don't understand that. They think, okay, it's a choice. You had a choice to do this. You had a choice to do that. They think it comes down to simple shit when it's more complex than they really fucking know. And instead of busting everybody down ASAP, I think they should get to know the niggas that's always on the block. I think they should get out their cars, smoke a square, chop it up, talk to everybody, get to know people, you in this neighborhood. Many posit that they and other young people like them are exceptionally visible to authorities, and authorities were very present and intimately involved in their lives and bodies, but that they were misrecognized in their interactions. State intimacy here does not generate connection or knowing, and this is what political science tends to assume. The more the state knows your preferences, the higher quality the democracy. But here, more fundamental than preferences is to be seen, to be understood in a more fulsome way. The state does not need to imagine my point of view or the neighborhood context of my decisions, my life history, or the constraints I face. The state is blind to my struggles and therefore sees fault for actions that, if I was seen in my full truth, would lead to a broader set of responses. This recognition premise operated at two levels. It was both a political desire. I need to be, it's a necessary condition to being regarded. I need to be known in a more fulsome way and not reduced. And it operated as what the violation is, the source of the violation. Because I'm unknown, the state's capacity for intervening in reasonable ways in my life and protecting me is lessened. I'm approached with contempt. The state does not have a presumption of my value. And as we'll see, it constructed their political response. Because I'm not known, I'm going to seek out those who affirm my identity. The next major theme that we kept coming across was this idea of what Bernadette Atwene calls state graft, right? The state has incredible ability to seize my assets. I'm up for the taking. We're tax collectors for the city. That we are the source of profit and revenue for the state. Meanwhile, our communities are financially depleted and strained. And, when you look to the broader literature, the fact that on average, people leaving prison are paying, $17,000 in debt, that a prison inmate is actually considered voluntarily unemployed. And so child support arrears stack up, right? Or the fact that many jails and probation systems charge inmates user fees and other predatory aspects. So I'm just going to show a few of these. And look how often they're constructing the state as this extractive entity that regularly comes in, seizes their assets. Let's read what I feel about the system. It's a system, but it's a system that's designed to make money. It's not about correcting anything. It's not about rehabilitating nobody. It's all about making money. It's funny because the police were nothing but a check to them. I'm reading the last one. When we do stuff bad, we get sent to jail and they get a paycheck while we just sit in there. None of that money is going to us. They just a paycheck for it. Every time I'm in court and they tell me to stand in line and call my name on the intercom, I feel like I'm back in school where they would have lockdowns that close the classroom doors. And if you got a tardy, you were late for class, they close the door. They'd say to the teachers, close the door and lock your door, so the kids get locked out. And then they opt to go outside and they all get disciplined and have to stand in line. And that standing in line mimics the standing in line that I see when you go to court and you have to pay and wait for your name to be called. And sometimes you're paying every single cent you have in your bank account so you can just get your license back, so you don't have to deal with it anymore. And even when you have community service, they make you pay fees on top of it. 20 to sign up, 80, 100 to sign up. It's never really built for people with no money. And if you don't have any money and you ignore it, you don't pay that becomes the crime. It becomes a crime. It starts to become a crime and builds up. The next theme, and Dan, you should tell me if I should, end so that we can get to some feedback, is what we're calling distorted responsiveness. Distorted responsiveness is the idea that people felt vulnerable on both flanks. They felt that they were policed heavily for small things, selling a loose square, cursing on somebody's answering machine. I interviewed somebody who, a pregnant woman who spent a weekend in jail for cursing on somebody's answering machine. But for serious emergencies and crisis and victimization, the police were nowhere to be found. And oftentimes this idea was in the same breath, right? They would say, I'm in this free fall of abandonment, but I can be crushed on a lark, right? So let me show you a few of what we mean by distorted responsiveness. Let's read this one. The police where I live at, they just take a long time to get there. Like, you can call them for anything. It don't matter what it is. And they be talking like they don't got enough force out here to come and help you when you really need them. But they be harassing people who ain't got nothing. Absolutely nothing. Yeah, they do shit when they're ready to do it, when it's beneficial to them. They really don't give a fuck about how you is. I really don't like the police. Like, they don't respond fast enough when you really need them. They rude as ever. They stop you for no apparent reason at all. Like, I feel like they do too much. Your mission is to serve and protect, but we see you as threats now. Me and my son, we scared to walk down the street. We go home, we shut all the doors, let all the blinds down, we go to bed. And then this last one, I'll let you read to yourselves. He's comparing the distorted responsiveness he gets from the state to an abusive father, right? Why is you the one harming me? Why is you protecting me? You the one harming me. One of the most common narratives is this idea of distorted responsiveness. Instead of responsive government agents that could be called on when in need, people experienced high levels of social control alongside acute state abandonment. They felt easy to abandon and abuse. Police authority was most energetic where it didn't matter for their lives, busting people for little things and other minor transgressions, but withholding, unheeding, and out of reach when they were steady dying. Aggressive patrolling then was yoked with ambivalence. This meant participants saw the police as useless and harmful at the same time, and they saw themselves as vulnerable to the state in both ways. To abandonment, as one said, they give you time to die, speaking of the, the person that was left bleeding out on her kitchen floor, and aggressive intervention. Not being heard, not being cared for when you're a victim, not being taken seriously when you make a police complaint is a form of non-responsiveness and disregard by the state. It is painful in its own right, but being treated harshly in the company of perceived abandonment is what we mean by distorted responsiveness. And finally, the last theme I wanted to explore with you is this idea of collective autonomy, communal autonomy. One of the things I mentioned we found in my earlier work was this idea of political withdrawal, that people learned that the state was about hierarchy and control, and that their encounters were often encounters that featured humiliation and violence. And so it was natural that they would withdraw from the system, that they would not seek out government agents when in need. And we see this in the dialogues for sure. There's this pattern of strategic avoidance, or what Michael Hanschen calls the ethics of aversion. I try to stay to myself and mind my business because things can go left at any moment, whether it's a fellow brother or whether it's a police officer, whether he is a fellow brother. I don't care. Let's read the last one. The police, they got badges. They can do what they want and it don't make no sense, and they can harass you for no reason. I don't have my ID on me right now, but I'm not doing anything. I don't want you standing in this spot. You got to move. That's why I don't even hang out no more. There's no point in hanging out. I stay in my house every day. This idea of recoiling from public space, from gathering with friends and neighbors, from having too many people on your front porch, from going out in public for fear of a police encounter. And yet, we also saw expressions of the need to come together as a community. So let's read the bottom ones. We are trying to police ourselves. No more call the police. Stay out of their way. Stop trying to look to them for protection. Stop getting in trouble with other people on the street, trying to use their services to come lock niggas up. Stop believing in their paperwork. Stop believing in their ass altogether. Yeah, we definitely need to do that. We are their enemy. It doesn't matter if it's a good boy, a bad boy, an old man, a young woman, a baby, it's a war zone. So they need to leave. How did we used to do it in the old days when something happened in the house, something happened in the hood? We know who to speak to. We know who to go to. Now we got to have the police who's a third party that don't know us, don't know the community. Again, misrecognition, don't know. And we trusting them? Just leave Black people alone. Just leave us alone. We don't need you to come in and tell us how to act. We don't need you to police us. We don't need that. You have no idea. You think you have an idea because you studied us, but you don't know us. So these aversive responses in the prior slide went hand in hand with an urgent desire to come together, to control our narratives, to know our history, to police ourselves. They offered up a vision of safety grounded in communal self-protection and knowledge, policing not just in, but of the community. Sometimes these aspirations were paired with very concrete ways they labored to protect youth in their community or to deny power to the police. In the dialogues, we can see them assert community authority over safety, as in this first example here that I haven't read, but you all can read to yourselves. We see an emphasis on collective community defense and protection based on community knowledge of what's going on with Tyrone and Tasha, and explicit demands to shift power and authority to the communities themselves. Sometimes it was expressed as more of an aspirational vision, right? As more of a, we need to build within our own communities. We need to focus on Black economies, and not coming together exacerbates our safety deprivation. It was not always clear how this would be actualized, but narrow policy prescription was not the goal. Aspiration for a different future was. And I'll read one more, just so that it's to give you an idea of the actual, this is a group that they had formed called the Hood Claimers. The whole idea about the Hood Claimers, like us policing our own neighborhoods, us interacting with each other and knowing who we need to call to take care of the knuckleheads, knowing what needs to be done when something goes wrong, and who you need to contact in order to correct it. Having parent advocates, having student advocates in the school, just people to insulate us so we ain't got to worry about no outsider coming into our community and monitoring us and managing us. We don't need no management. We govern ourselves. And another one talks about this village in Africa, and says, when somebody does something bad, like instead of, killing them, or like instead of locking them up or something, they put them in the middle of the village. And like everybody comes from the village, everybody comes out, and they tell the person the good things that they have done before. Like, you've done this, you've done that. Like, why are you doing this? And that's how, he was kind of showing that as a vision of restorative justice. I want to conclude here so we can get to some questions. Our book project, The State from Below, calls on scholars to analyze racial oppression through policing as relevant to our understanding of repressive and coercive practices within nominally democratic regimes. Why do we study policing as a sideshow to democratic governance? In a small criminal justice literature, not a literature concerned with subnational authoritarianism, political violence, and state-sponsored repressive projects. We need to stop sequestering police repression from questions of democracy. Not having this commitment has been devastating to our fields of knowledge, to anticipating and understanding the current moment. We join a very few scholars who have presented frameworks for understanding racial repression in a democratic state, and how authoritarian practices may coexist with formally democratic states, like Michael Hanchard, who reminds us that the most celebrated democracies had the longest histories of racial slavery, subjugation, imperialism, police terror, and highly unequal labor regimes. I hope to unsettle these framings of American democracy. What Portal's participants know is that their experience of government bears precious little resemblance to official governance or written law. They illustrate to us the disconnect between what is claimed in theories of American democracy and what is actually realized. The second thing I want to focus on is actually the last point here, portals as a public good. We went into this thinking, wow, what a nifty medium for gathering data. But throughout the process, we realized portals aren't simply a medium for gathering data. They're a public good that enhances the civic significance and connections of race-class subjugated communities. They're an intervention into local communities that offer us a glimpse of something other than what we have, of civic space as rerouted away from surveillance and towards community power. Communities not only enter the chamber to share their vision of democracy, but they use the portal as a resource for learning and building cross-city networks of resistance, new frameworks, rousing cross-neighborhood, cross-city consciousness, and activating the political imagination. In our portal sites, we began to see something that we hadn't anticipated. They created new possibilities for civic life and power, and they showed what it might mean to construct public spaces focused on civic enhancement rather than surveillance. We began to see that these forums and the links that they engendered may over time enable communities to reclaim power and engage in the process of police abolition. Our curators began to report to us that aldermen were visiting parts of the city they had never come to before. They were tackling problems together. The portal had changed their community's image. The community pulsed with a new sense of opportunity and connectedness. Kids without passports were traveling to distant places. Residents explored their neighborhood's mass loss of men to gun violence and police violence and incarceration, with the Tutsis in Kigali speaking about their mass loss during the genocidal state campaigns in Rwanda. The portal, they were creating a rap album in a dozen cities. They had stopped store owners from selling tobacco and liquor to those underage, and they initiated, as I mentioned before, a gang truce. They worked out a gang truce, both without the use of police. When the Baltimore portal was vandalized, the community responded by inviting local artists to teach youth about the political and aesthetic origins of street art and collaborated with them to paint a mural on the front. In other words, the portal had become not just a medium for listening as we had originally thought, it became a platform to build power, to collaborate, and to enact liberation. Where of the unfree. We began to see that it was an engaged space to unsettle civic ostracism and unequal power and imagine new forms of youth attachment as the next generation of civic leaders, not as targets for surveillance. Without affirmation of their political knowledge and their visions of freedom, the most unfree will continue to have their citizenship defined by surveillance and punishment. Or we can build spaces where people and groups across cities can employ their local wisdoms to strengthen Black and Brown liberation. Thank you. I would love your questions on any part. I only mentioned to you some of the most prominent themes, but there are many others. So please ask me anything. And Dan, would you like me to field the questions, or would
No, I'm happy to jump in. So if you can turn off the PowerPoint part of it. So that was so great, and we have a bunch of questions. I'm going to start us off with a question, which you covered in such a compelling way, these 5 themes that capture broad resonance. So I'm wondering, were there areas of particularly interesting divergence? And I can think of a bunch, like whether there was divergence generationally, whether there was divergence between neighborhoods. Was there anything that stood out to you where there was like just this separation in some interesting patterned way that just caught your eye?
That's a great question. And I should say, so we are now fielding, so one of the cool things we're doing with these concepts, right, that haven't been measured on by anyone, we're taking the ways that people articulated and narrated the concepts that I've described: distorted responsiveness, misrecognition. In the broader project, we talk about 2 constitutions, 2 dueling ideas: what the state does as a matter of law and what the state actually does in my community. And we're putting them on the collective, the Cooperative Multiracial Politics Survey, which has a sample of 30,000 people. And so we can see, our sample is a purposive sample, right? Intentionally so. Like these are areas, that are missed. And this is part of my, part of Becky Pettit's argument, part of my own work. We largely miss these highly policed communities in our survey samples. And so we actually don't know when journalists after Ferguson said, well, the Michael Browns of America think this, we actually don't know that, right? They are actually wrong in saying that. And so we're putting these ideas on a very large survey to see, do Black Americans, a much more representative sample, do they articulate themes of misrecognition? And we have several ways of tapping that. And one of the divergences, to your question, that we found is between white and Black. So in the portals, I know I mainly focused on race class subjugated communities, but we had white participants in the portals, right? We had various different groups, and it's really, really striking to see interracial conversations. So one comes to my mind where it was actually between two people from Baltimore, but the white man, the Baltimore County resident, was visiting LA as a tourist. And he comes into the portal and he's talking to a Baltimore City resident. And their conversation is fascinating because they're basically describing two different Baltimores. And the man, I wish I had the conversation in front of me, I don't, but let me paraphrase it. The Baltimore City man describes his experience. The white Baltimore County man who's in LA says, that never happened to me. That can't possibly be right. The police were always friendly. Like when they showed up at our, frat parties to like, get us to stop doing what we were doing, they were really benevolent and kind and, and the Baltimore man keeps pushing back and saying, well, this is our experience. And the Baltimore, the white man says, well, I just don't understand that because that's not the life I lead. And the Baltimore City man ends up saying, well, when we were kids, we would go into the J.C. Murphy and steal little, packs of gum. And the police would take us down to the police station, put heavy phone books on our heads and beat us with the nightsticks because that didn't leave any marks, but it would leave us ringing in our ears. And what's beautiful about the conversation is, I think it's a perfect meta narrative for what our country is going through right now, right? Black communities are telling people we do not live in an American democracy the way you experience it. This is our experience. And over the past however many decades, they've been told, really? That can't possibly be right. Well, what was the person doing when they were shot in the back 17 times, right? And so it's this way in which you see a great deal of learning taking place, right? Where one person is describing his political reality to the other. And there's a little bit of like resistance to it. And then lo and behold, they learn. So divergences happened interracially. Intra-racially, there's some interesting patterns that happen between intergenerational pairings. I always find it very interesting. Like I'm thinking of one conversation where a former gang member is talking, he grew up in the same neighborhood as the person he's talking to, and that happens a lot between Milwaukee and Chicago. And he's like, look, this is my experience, we had knives, y'all are doing it with guns, y'all are going crazy, y'all are completely amok. Why do you do this? Why are you, we kept it, we kind of kept it sane and safe, and you're just going amok. And the guy says, and he's 18 years old, he's like, well, because I want my RIP. I don't have anything else. I don't have a good, I don't have letters behind my name. I don't have basketball fame. I don't have, money, a name. And so what I want is my RIP. And when I didn't understand what that meant at first. What he meant was, I want my rest in peace. I want somebody after I've been killed, as and he actually says, I probably won't make it to age 30. He says, after I've seen my day, some people will speak my name. I will have status, right? So there are interesting, and then a real divergence is I could pull it up, is when people disagree, when they have fundamental disagreements about what should be done. And normally this occurs between people I would label as coming from the Black conservative tradition and people coming from a more Black radical tradition. So there are some, and part of this has to do with the curator that we had in Milwaukee, who hang very tightly to if you just comply with police, if you keep your nose clean, if you do what you should be doing, everything will be all right. It's that we need to clean our house first. We're running amok, we're running wild, and we need to clean our house first before anybody else can help us. That's the sort of Black conservative, you know, sort of, we need to and you saw it actually in the one that talks about I should be keeping my shorties safe 24, I'm in this neighborhood 24/7. He's a Black conservative. He spends most of the conversation talking about the failures within the community, what the community needs to do before anything else can happen. And he's very much about compliance, right? On the other side of that are people that say, no, there is no reforming the police. It's not about us cleaning our houses first. This is a system that is built on slavery. This is a system that was designed to oppress us since slave patrols. And this is a system, I remember one where they really disagreed. I mean, they went back and forth. It was a very heated, I mean, I was glad they were in a portal because I felt like they would have come to blows. Where one man says, you know, you think that you can reform individual bad officers and that will take care of the problem. But I see this system as a rotten apple, and you're not going to bite into a rotten apple. The whole thing is bad. You're not going to just, you know, bite around the parts that are bad to get to the good parts. The whole thing needs to be thrown away. So those were some of the disagreements and tensions. I would say the other divergences were cross city. So you get certain kind of themes far more heavily in. So in Baltimore, the theme of exit is very heavy. It's not about reforming the police. It's about getting out of Baltimore. You know, people saying, you know, I'm not gonna, this place has gone to shit and I need to just find my way to get out. That's a theme that doesn't really surface in other cities. Gentrification is a really big theme in LA. I would say I was very surprised that the Latino population in our study, I thought that they would be more similar to Black participants in their views. They are not. They are far more trusting of police, far more ready to see police reform as viable. And part of that is, I think we captured not the kind of, you know, Latino population that Victor Rios is capturing in Oakland. We were capturing a upwardly mobile working class Latino population, many of whom had people in their families who were members of law enforcement. They did sometimes talk about ICE and about, you know, show me your papers kinds of interactions, but I was surprised that on the whole, they were far less likely to enunciate a police abolitionist kind of perspective.
So great, thank you. So we have 16 questions and more pouring in, and so I'm not surprised at all. And we have 7 minutes. So I'm gonna try to bundle a few of these. As I'm sure you've seen these kind of questions, a number of these questions before about, some of these are kind of quizzical about the portals, like, you know, does this make sense? And some of these are wildly enthusiastic about the portals and want to know how broadly we can go with it. So let me give you an example, and you can probably see these too, awesome Q&A. So Jaden asked, for instance, why establish a new space for this project? Why not utilize pre-existing spaces? What did that decision-making process look like for you? If those spaces don't already exist, why would they be willing to share in the portal space? And just kind of similar to this, how do dialogues about race and police encounters differ in portals compared to everyday conversation? So those are give a flavor of the kind of questions people have about, you know, so why the portals and what are they doing? But then just to capture a flavor of a bunch of other questions, you have a question here about, have you considered reintroducing portals to more cities given the 2020 Black Lives Matter protest? Would it be valuable to, this is a different question, to install portals in more privileged areas to spread awareness? Would that maybe spark political activism or political empathy? And then there's also a question, I missed it somewhere here about, you know, wouldn't this be great in kind of getting over the blue versus red state divide as portals? So there's a bundle of portal questions for you. Dive in where you'd like to.
You know, so on this last question, I'm going to be really honest with you that we toyed with the idea of placing the portals in places like, you know, Kathy Kramer's, you know, rural Wisconsin areas where, you know, some of the articulations in her work around alienation and the state. The state is not a predatory force, but it's also not, it's not a helping force, right? It has left them alienated and abandoned in similar ways to our portals narrative. And we backed off of that idea. And part of the reason is, I hope you saw from the video, this space becomes a space of joy and of people with similar experiences, even though there's difference, getting to share together. And we had a few conversations where, like you saw in the video, where we had some police come in. Oh, wouldn't it be great for the police to learn from the people that they are policing and to hopefully have a more humane, attitude. And you know what, I'm gonna be honest, it didn't work. It was terrible, it was a disaster. The power asymmetries were too pitched. There was no learning taking place. It was more like an interrogation. And we did not feel that Pride of Place should go to educating white people or educating police. That's somebody else's job. We felt that Pride of Place needed to go to the Black counterpublic space. And here's where I'm going to pivot to, why establish a new space for this project. The person that asked this question, I thank you, because this is somewhat similar to the way the barbershop functions, right, in the Black counterpublic, right? Communal spaces where people are free to share and theorize and debate, free from the gaze, free from the white gaze, okay, free from surveillance. These are places where, and we intended them to be that. And in some places, they really took off, right? They really did become a site of a communal hub. And I wouldn't say that, so I'm pivoting, I'm moving around a little bit, but we did not want, we knew that the possibilities coming out of connecting places like Newark, the Amani neighborhood with places like Boyle Heights was going to yield something that was important to the local communities, and that we didn't want, even though I gave you the example of the white man talking to the man from his hometown, we didn't want this thing of peering in, right? Of let me come in and spend an hour in your shoes kind of thing. We wanted for communities to be able to narrate to one another of similar positions what their experience was like, and to build moments of activism, which they did. There were hundreds of examples of things that took place that would not have otherwise. Now, I don't know that I've satisfied the question about why build a new space for this project, but I do think connection is a vital political resource, and it is one that is often in low supply in cross-spatially, right? You're not getting, the Amani neighborhood wasn't connecting with the South Side of Chicago, wasn't connecting with Skid Row in LA to learn from their experience and to collaborate together. And our hope was that by breaking down the barrier of physical distance, we not only create the barbershop-like counterpublic space within the community, but we also invite moments of collaboration across communities. The Amani neighborhood, these aren't places where there are active Black Lives Matter chapters. These are places where, 40% of the local population was in and out of a jail, right? After we moved the portal, after the portal needed to close down and move to another site, they literally took over an abandoned building, spray painted it gold, and continued the portal because it meant something to them. They housed 15 unhoused boys, youth who had really found their life's work in the portal, using the portal to continue the connections. And they had a screen, right? Instead of the shipping container, they put a portal screen up. So I guess, yes, there are spaces in these in communities that are vital civic spaces. I'm not saying that we sort of replace those, or we are, some sort of, new thing that should be done. But they aren't spaces that connect people cross city, or where, the local community can define its own goals, do whatever it wants with the portal, right? And, sometimes I'm amazed at how, we have all these policy folks designing interventions. They parachute into communities, they drop a little something on them. And it's amazing to me, like, why not create civic spaces? Eric Kleinenberg's ideal of palaces of the people, places where people can constellate, can build bridges, can collaborate. It's relatively cheap to do so, but yields a lot, right? Anyway, thank you for the question, Jaden.
So for our last question, I'm going to bundle a bunch of questions together also for this last one, which are all under the category of what is to be done. And one of the classic questions here that several people raised is, what is your opinion in terms of defunding the police?
I'm a big supporter of defunding campaigns, and I think defunding campaigns are very misunderstood. The reason I'm a big supporter is that they pose, for the first time in my lifetime, a true reorientation of what the state is and does. They are posing a paradigm shift. It's not just about how much money, the title is sort of, unfortunate. It's not just about abolishing a police force or defunding. It is about providing a vision for structures that would create well-being and abundance, right? That would create that would, where our response to safety deprivation, and I use that term very intentionally, right? This isn't about crime and violence. It is about safety deprivation. These are places that, for the same reasons that we would talk about public health crises or talk about, low quality schooling. These are spaces that have been created, maintained, reproduced by state projects. And once you recognize that, and once you recognize that there are alternative means for getting to safety, like the African village example I mentioned, you realize that we don't need to be pouring resources into a body whose sole idea is to engage with the question of safety deprivation through a single lens. Okay, so I am a supporter of defund. I do consider myself an abolitionist. I do not think that in years of studying this problem, I have never seen a single policy reform that has reoriented the nature of state-citizen relations. And that's what this problem is about. It is about a state that sees communities and certain populations as suspects first, and as citizens worthy of abundance second. And so I think the defund campaign has instead of, we've been arguing about things over here when what the defund campaigns did, and one of our portal sites was in the Let Us Breathe collective in Chicago that mobilized. You saw in the video when she said, everything I see here, breathe here, I'm taking it home. She had gone to, there was a group of activists that had gone to Ferguson, and then they had brought their ideas back to Chicago, set up an abolitionist movement outside of the infamous Black site, Holman Square, and trying to shut down that site of police torture. And, so anyway, I think it is high time that we have a fundamental reorientation of how the state operates in race, class, subjugated communities. And police abolitionism and defunding campaigns propose to acknowledge that there are other sites that ought to be funded, other places, other actors, other sites, other spaces that can counter safety deprivation than police. And we've given too much power to police. And so I agree with that.
Great. That was so good. I'm drooling after 8 p.m. on my time, so I'm really, floored. I really hope you can come back and join us during the next stages of this project. It just is an impressive project, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for inviting me to share. I hope that you all enjoyed the presentation and learned something from it. Thank you for being here. And actually, I would love to, since we didn't get to all the Q&A, if you can like capture them or maybe I can, if there's a way to like cut and paste them, I would love to see and think about and engage with these questions as I move forward with the project.
Yeah, we will do our best to do that. But we can't wait for the book, and so we have to have you back to tell us all about it.
Thank you, Dan. I hope everything is going well out there in Oregon. I would much rather be with you in person and with all of you, but thank you for being here virtually.
Great. So have a great night, everyone. Be well.
Thanks, everyone.